The late-night air felt thick and suffocating, wrapping around the empty streets like a heavy cloak. The flickering streetlights cast broken patches of pale yellow across the cracked pavement as 12-year-old Jalen Brooks quickened his pace, his small hands clutching the straps of his backpack tightly. He shouldn't have stayed out this late. His grandma would be worried, his mom would be angry, but time always disappeared when he was playing video games at his friend's house. Now, walking alone through the dimly lit neighborhood, the silence around him was too loud, every shadow stretching too far, every rustling sound setting his nerves on edge. His heart pounded faster as he turned a corner, eyes locked on the distant glow of his apartment building. Just a few more blocks. Just a little faster. The slow hum of tires rolling over asphalt made his stomach drop. The headlights cut through the darkness, washing over the empty sidewalk as a police cruiser eased up behind him. Jalen stiffened, his breath catching in his throat as the car crept alongside him, its engine purring like a waiting predator. The passenger door swung open, and from the darkness of the vehicle, a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out, his silhouette imposing against the streetlight. "Hey, kid," the officer's voice was casual, but there was no warmth in it. "Where you coming from?" Jalen froze, his mind scrambling for the right answer. He had done nothing wrong, yet his pulse hammered as if he had. "Just heading home," he managed to say, forcing himself to stand still, to keep his tone even. The officer, his badge glinting under the streetlight, took a step closer. His name tag read Hardwell. Another officer remained in the driver's seat, his expression unreadable, but his gaze never wavered from Jalen. "This your neighborhood?" Hardwell asked, tilting his head as if Jalen being here didn't quite make sense. "Yes, sir." Jalen tried not to shrink under the officer's stare. He knew better than to seem nervous, but his skin prickled under the weight of their scrutiny. "What you got in your pockets?" Hardwell asked, his voice still casual, but his stance had shifted, his shoulders squared. Jalen's fingers twitched, and without thinking, he stuffed his hands into the pockets of his hoodie, a small, instinctive gesture, something to ground himself. "Hands out," Hardwell barked suddenly, his voice snapping like a whip. Jalen's stomach lurched. He yanked his hands out immediately, fingers splayed, showing he had nothing to hide. But he saw it in Hardwell's face. He had already made up his mind. A silent signal passed between the officers. In one swift motion, Hardwell grabbed Jalen's arm. The grip was like iron, rough fingers pressing into his jacket. Jalen gasped, trying to pull away on instinct, but before he could protest, Hardwell yanked him forward. His small body stumbled, and suddenly, a sharp force slammed him down. His chest hit the cold pavement, his knee scraped against the rough concrete, and before he could cry out, his arms were wrenched behind his back. A sharp pain shot through his shoulders as his wrists were twisted, and the hard pressure of a knee pressed into the middle of his back, crushing the air from his lungs. "Stop resisting." Hardwell's voice was a growl. "I'm not." Jalen tried, but the weight against him only increased. His cheek was mashed against the pavement, the grit biting into his skin, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. Behind him, he heard the other officer, Branson, still standing by the car, watching but not stopping it. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A car passed, slowing slightly, then kept driving. No one stopped. No one asked why a grown man was pinning a child to the ground. The metallic click of handcuffs snapped in Jalen's ears. His wrists burned as the cold steel clamped too tight around them. Hardwell hauled him up roughly, shoving him forward toward the open back door of the cruiser. Jalen's legs wobbled, but he forced himself not to cry, not to beg, even though his eyes stung and his breath hitched in his throat. His whole body ached as he climbed into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind him. The car smelled of sweat and stale leather, the cage between the seats sealing him off from any escape. The car started moving, and Jalen let his head fall against the window, his heart still pounding as his reflection stared back at him. Wide, frightened eyes, a bruise already blooming on his cheek. From the front seat, Hardwell's voice was calm, almost lazy. "You can say whatever you want, kid." His fingers tapped rhythmically against the steering wheel. "But who's gonna believe you?" Jalen squeezed his eyes shut. His whole body trembled as the weight of those words settled over him, suffocating him. He knew the truth. It didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter what really happened. Nobody was going to listen. Malcolm Grayson sat stiffly in the dimly lit holding room, his sharp eyes fixed on the frail boy sitting across from him, small hands clenched together, wrists still red from the cuffs that had been too tight. The boy looked up, wide-eyed, exhausted, shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller, like he had already learned that taking up space in the wrong way could get him hurt. Malcolm had seen this before, too many times, too many kids with the same expression, the same quiet resignation, the same unspoken plea buried beneath the surface. But something about Jalen Brooks hit different, something about the bruises on his cheek, the way his lip trembled when he thought no one was looking, the fact that he was only 12. He was too young for this, too young to be sitting behind a steel table in a room that smelled like sweat and old coffee, too young to have his future decided by people who saw him as nothing more than a case number. Malcolm took a slow breath, straightened his tie, and made a decision. This wasn't going to be just another case. This wasn't just another boy lost in the system. This was personal now. The first thing he did was demand the footage, the body cam recordings that should have captured the entire arrest, every second of what had happened on that cold, empty street, every movement, every word, every moment that led to a child being thrown face-first into the pavement. He was prepared for excuses, but when the prosecutor slid the report across the table, when she sighed and gave him that carefully neutral expression that government employees used when they wanted to seem regretful but weren't, he knew exactly what was coming. The footage is unavailable. The words were smooth, polished, carefully practiced, but they may as well have been a slap in the face. The cameras had malfunctioned. The files were corrupted. The evidence that could clear a 12-year-old boy had simply disappeared. Malcolm clenched his jaw so tight his teeth ached, his fingers twitching against the table, but he didn't let it show, didn't let them see the anger boiling under the surface. He had expected this. He had seen it before. And now he knew exactly what kind of fight he was walking into. Cassandra Brooks stood just outside the courtroom, her wrinkled hands trembling as she gripped the handle of her worn-out purse, eyes darting toward every officer that passed, her entire body tensed like she was waiting for someone to tell her this was all a mistake, that she could take her grandson home, that none of this was real. But it was real, and no matter how many times she told herself to stay strong, to keep her head high, to fight like she always had, her heart still ached with a deep, relentless fear. Jalen was her world, the only thing she had left, and now they were trying to take him from her. She had pleaded, argued, demanded answers, but all she got in return was cold, dismissive stares and the same infuriating statement. Jalen had attacked an officer. That was the story they were running with, the lie they were holding on to, the excuse they were using to justify locking up a child. Cassandra had never felt so powerless in her life, but she wasn't going to give up. She wouldn't let them bury her grandson in paperwork, wouldn't let them steal his future without a fight. Jalen sat on the hard cot in the juvenile detention cell, knees pulled to his chest, the thin blanket wrapped tightly around his shoulders as if it could protect him from the cold that seeped through the concrete walls. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, the shadows in the corners stretched long and dark, the distant sound of muffled voices echoing through the hall. He didn't belong here. He didn't know how he got here. Every second since that night felt like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. And no matter how many times he told himself to stay strong, to breathe, to not cry, the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. The other kids in the holding area barely looked at him, their faces blank, their eyes dull, like they had already learned that hope was a waste of time. He didn't want to be like them. He didn't want to give up. But what choice did he have? No one believed him. No one ever did. Somewhere across town, Louis Devereaux leaned forward in his chair, fingers tapping against his keyboard, eyes narrowed as he read over the case details, the words blurring together as he tried to make sense of what he already knew to be true. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a routine arrest. This was something bigger. He had spent years exposing corruption, years digging through the lies, years chasing stories that the system wanted to keep buried, and now he had a feeling this was one of them. He didn't know the kid. He didn't know the lawyer. But he knew injustice when he saw it. And he wasn't going to look away. The courtroom was quiet when the judge finally spoke, her voice even, emotionless, her expression unreadable as she glanced between the prosecutor and Malcolm, between the officers and the small, terrified boy sitting at the defendant's table. Malcolm sat up straighter, waiting, bracing himself for the ruling, for the decision that could change everything. Jalen held his breath, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair so tight they ached, the hope flickering in his chest like a weak flame. And then the words came. Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody until trial. The gavel hit the desk. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Jalen felt his stomach drop, his heartbeat stutter, his breath catch in his throat. The guards moved before he could process what was happening, before he could even turn to look at his grandmother, before he could reach for Malcolm, before he could say a word. Cold hands gripped his arms. The metal door swung open. The weight of the moment crashed down on him all at once. He wasn't going home. The courtroom was colder than before, the air thick with something heavier than silence, something that made the wooden benches feel harder, the lights feel harsher, the space between Jalen and the judge feel wider. His hands trembled slightly as he rested them on the worn table, his fingers pressing into the rough surface as if trying to hold onto something solid, something real. His heart pounded against his ribs, the bruises beneath his shirt still throbbing from that night, his skin still remembering the weight of the pavement, the crushing force of the knee between his shoulder blades, the burn of the cuffs biting too deep. His mind screamed at him to stay quiet, to keep his head down, to let Malcolm do the talking, to let the adults handle it, because that was what everyone had always told him to do. Keep quiet, don't make trouble, don't give them a reason. But they had already found their reason, already decided who he was, already written his story before he had the chance to tell it himself. And now, sitting in a chair that felt too big, staring at people who looked at him like he was nothing more than a problem to be solved, he realized something that made his stomach tighten. If he didn't speak now, no one else would. He pushed himself up from the chair, his legs unsteady, his breath shaky, the weight of the room pressing down on him from all sides, but his voice came out stronger than he thought possible. The police beat me. The words sliced through the courtroom like a whip, sharp, raw, undeniable. The reaction was immediate. The quiet hum of whispers that had filled the background disappeared in an instant, like someone had cut the sound out of the air itself. The judge, who had barely looked at him before, who had treated him like just another case, just another file in a stack of too many, suddenly met his eyes, her sharp gaze locking onto him as if she was seeing him for the first time. Judge Karen Blake had spent years listening to excuses, to lies, to half-truths woven together by lawyers on both sides, but as she looked at the boy standing in front of her, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides, his shoulders stiff with something too heavy for a child to carry, she noticed something she had missed before. A faint, yellowing bruise just beneath the collar of his oversized shirt, a mark that hadn't been there at the last hearing, a detail that suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Across the room, Officer Branson shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping against his knee, his posture too rigid, his breathing just a little too controlled. He had told himself from the beginning that this wasn't his problem, that it wasn't his responsibility to question what happened that night, that his job wasn't to interfere. But now, with the weight of the judge's stare lingering between them, with the boy's voice still ringing in his ears, with the memory of that night crawling back up his spine, he could feel it, the slow, creeping pressure of something he didn't want to name. Malcolm didn't look at Branson. He didn't look at the judge. He kept his focus locked on Jalen, his mind already running through the possible outcomes, already calculating how this would change the case, already knowing the kind of storm this statement was about to bring down on them both. He could feel the tension behind him, could sense the officers watching him, could hear the unspoken message laced beneath their silence. He had felt this before, had seen the way the system pushed back when someone tried to crack it open, had learned a long time ago that when a black lawyer fought for a black child against a room full of people who had already decided his fate, the threats didn't have to be spoken to be understood. Walk away, they were saying without saying it. Let it go. This isn't your fight. But Malcolm wasn't built that way. Across town, in a small newsroom buzzing with quiet urgency, Louis Devereaux sat hunched over his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys, his eyes scanning the live courtroom feed, his pulse thrumming with the unmistakable rush of a story too big to ignore. The words formed faster than he could think, piecing together the truth in sentences that would hit the public like a shockwave. 12-year-old boy accuses officers of assault during arrest. Courtroom silenced as allegations surface. He could already see the reactions, the ripples spreading, the way the public would respond, the way the department would scramble to control the damage. He had covered stories like this before, had dug through the lies, had chased the truth through locked doors and sealed reports, but this was different. This was a child. By the time the story hit the local news that evening, the department had already prepared their response, their statement carefully crafted, their voices measured, their words designed to do what the system always did when the truth threatened to break through. "These are false accusations," the spokesperson said, standing before a podium, eyes calm, tone controlled. "The department stands by our officers and their commitment to justice. We urge the public not to jump to conclusions based on misinformation." The words dripped with polished certainty, with the kind of manufactured authority that made people doubt their own eyes, that turned facts into opinions, that twisted a child's voice into just another noise lost in the static. Jalen sat in his cell that night, staring at the dull concrete wall, listening to the distant echo of a television in the guard's office, the sound of the news anchor's voice rattling through the hallway. He knew what they were saying. He knew what they wanted people to believe. He knew this wasn't over. But for the first time since that night, since the cold pavement and the crushing weight and the fear that had sunk into his bones, he felt something different, something small but unshakable, something burning beneath his ribs like a tiny ember refusing to go out. They had heard him. Malcolm Grayson stood in front of the judge's bench, his voice sharp, unwavering, cutting through the tension in the courtroom like a blade. "Your Honor, this case is riddled with inconsistencies, procedural violations, and missing evidence. The police department claims the body cam footage was corrupted, yet no report was filed to confirm a technical malfunction. They claim Jalen Brooks attacked an officer, yet no injuries were documented on the officers involved. They claim his arrest was lawful, yet a minor was interrogated without legal representation or a guardian present. How many red flags does this court need before we acknowledge the obvious? This case demands a full review." His words hung in the air, challenging, unshakable, but Judge Blake remained still, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, her expression unreadable as she listened. The prosecution shifted uneasily, their carefully rehearsed arguments already unraveling under the weight of the facts Malcolm was throwing at them, but this fight was just beginning and Malcolm knew it. Across town, in a small apartment above a convenience store, a man sat on a sagging couch, his hands trembling slightly as he scrolled through the latest news report. Terrence Bolton hadn't planned to speak, hadn't planned to get involved, hadn't planned to remember that night, but the boy's face was burned into his mind, that small, helpless figure being thrown against the pavement like he was nothing, the way the officer had pressed his knee down as if daring the world to watch and say nothing. Terrence had seen a lot in his years, had learned the hard way that speaking up could cost you everything. But as he watched the news anchor replay the clip of Jalen in court, his voice steady, his hands clenched at his sides, saying, "The police beat me," something in Terrence shifted. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen for a long moment, and then, with a deep breath, he made the call. Inside the precinct, Hardwell's rage was a slow-building storm, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw locked so tight it ached. The kid was supposed to be easy to silence. The lawyer was supposed to back off. The press was supposed to lose interest. But now there was a damn witness, and that changed everything. Branson sat stiffly at his desk, avoiding Hardwell's glare, but he could feel it drilling into the side of his head, the silent, unspoken threat wrapping around his throat like a tightening noose. "You need to get yourself together." Hardwell's voice was low, dangerous, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be a warning. "You're not thinking of saying anything stupid, are you?" Branson swallowed hard, his fingers tapping anxiously against the desk, his mind racing through every possible exit, every way this could go wrong, but the truth was, it was already wrong, had been wrong from the moment they put their hands on that kid. Cassandra Brooks was a storm that refused to be silenced. She stood outside the courthouse, her voice loud, her presence undeniable, surrounded by a growing crowd of activists, journalists, and community leaders who had finally started paying attention. They took my grandson in the dead of night. They threw him to the ground like he was nothing. And now they want to bury the truth? We will not be silent. The cameras flashed, the chants grew louder, and the pressure mounted. She had spent her life fighting for the people in her community, had spent years watching the system swallow young black boys whole, but she wasn't about to let them take Jalen without a fight. They wanted him to disappear, but she was going to make sure his name was heard in every corner of this city. Inside the courtroom, Judge Blake exhaled slowly, her fingers drumming lightly against the desk as she looked from Malcolm to the prosecution, her mind weighing the weight of what she was about to say. She had spent years on this bench, had seen every kind of case, every kind of defense, every kind of lie, but something about this one unsettled her, something about the boy's voice, the bruises, the missing footage, the way the department kept shifting its explanations. She wasn't ready to throw the entire system into chaos, but she couldn't ignore what was in front of her, couldn't pretend the pieces added up when they didn't. The court grants a 48-hour extension for the defense to gather additional evidence, she said finally, her voice steady but firm. We will reconvene after that period. Malcolm gave a sharp nod, already planning his next move, already knowing that this was their opening, the crack in the wall they needed. 48 hours wasn't much, but it was enough to make something happen. Across the courtroom, the prosecution stiffened, whispering furiously among themselves, already preparing their counterattack. But then everything shifted. Terrence Bolton was gone. Malcolm's phone buzzed first, a short, clipped message from Lewis. Our witness just disappeared. No one's seen him since last night. His stomach dropped as he processed the words, his mind racing through the implications. He grabbed his coat, already heading for the door, already dialing the number, but the call went straight to voicemail. At the same time, Branson sat frozen in his chair at the precinct, watching as Hardwell leaned back with a slow, knowing smirk, a look that sent ice crawling down Branson's spine. No words were needed. The message was clear. Outside, the city moved on like nothing had happened, like a key witness hadn't vanished overnight, like a 12-year-old boy wasn't sitting in a cell waiting for someone to save him. 48 hours. That was all they had. And now, Malcolm wasn't just fighting for the truth, he was fighting against a system that had already decided the truth didn't matter. Branson sat at his desk, his fingers twitching against the edge of his keyboard, his pulse thudding in his ears as the weight of everything pressed down on his chest like a slow-moving avalanche. He had told himself from the beginning that this wasn't his fight, that his job was to back up his partner, follow orders, keep his head down, but Hardwell had gone too far. First the kid, then the missing footage. Then Terrence Bolton vanishing overnight like he had never existed. Branson wasn't stupid. He had seen how these things played out before, had watched as people who spoke up suddenly found themselves transferred, demoted, or worse, but this time was different, because this time, he had seen it with his own eyes. The bruises, the fear, the way the kid's voice cracked when he said, "They beat me." Branson wanted to believe that Hardwell had just lost his temper, that it had been a moment of bad judgment, but deep down, he knew better. This wasn't about anger. This was about control. And Hardwell never lost control unless he wanted to. Across the city, Malcolm Grayson was already moving, his mind running at a speed that his body barely kept up with, his breath short as he flipped through files, notes, transcripts, anything that might help him fill the gaping hole left by their missing witness. The department had buried the body cam footage, but Lewis had found something else. An overhead security camera, mounted on a rundown liquor store across the street, had captured part of the arrest, the grainy footage showing the exact moment Hardwell slammed Jalen into the pavement. It wasn't perfect. The angle was bad, the image shaky, but it was enough. Enough to show that the boy hadn't been resisting. Enough to show that Hardwell's use of force had been deliberate, not reactive. Enough to prove that the police had lied. Louis Devereaux's fingers flew across his keyboard, the newsroom humming with the quiet intensity of an incoming storm as he pieced together the article that would set the city on fire. Pattern of abuse, Officer Hardwell's troubling history of excessive force. The words burned across the screen as he dug through records, past cases, complaints that had been filed and then mysteriously dropped, families who had tried to seek justice only to find doors slammed in their faces. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the 10th. Hardwell had been doing this for years, moving through the system like a ghost, protected by paperwork, by silence, by people like Branson who had looked the other way. But not this time. This time, someone had spoken. This time, there was proof. And now the world was watching. The courtroom was packed tighter than before, the air thick with anticipation as Malcolm stood before Judge Blake, his hands steady, his voice sharp as he laid the new evidence before her. The judge's gaze flickered across the screen as the footage played, her expression giving nothing away, but Malcolm saw it. The slight tension in her jaw, the shift in her posture, the way her fingers tapped once against the desk before she looked up. Officer Hardwell. Her voice cut through the room like a knife, cool and precise. The defense has presented new video evidence contradicting the initial police report. Would you care to explain why your department's footage of the same event is missing? Hardwell didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of controlled indifference as he folded his arms and spoke with the same smooth, calculated confidence that had protected him for years. Technical failure, Your Honor. Unfortunate, but not uncommon. The body cam system isn't perfect. Files get corrupted all the time. His voice was even, his expression unreadable, but Malcolm saw the lie in the way his fingers curled just slightly against the table, in the way his shoulders held just a fraction too much tension. Judge Blake's gaze didn't waver. You're telling me that a department-issued recording device, required by law to document all public interactions, just happened to malfunction at the exact moment this arrest took place? Hardwell didn't miss a beat. It happens. A beat of silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, the room holding its breath as if waiting for something, waiting for the moment everything would crack. Branson inhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair as the words fought their way to the surface, the truth clawing at his throat, refusing to stay buried any longer. He had spent weeks lying to himself, telling himself that it wasn't his problem, that it wasn't his responsibility, that keeping his mouth shut was the safest choice. But then he saw Jalen's face, not the terrified boy from the night of the arrest, but the boy standing in this courtroom, staring at him, waiting, hoping, because Branson was the only one left who could tell the truth. His pulse pounded against his ribs as he slowly pushed himself up from his seat, his movements slow, deliberate, every muscle in his body tense as he stepped forward, as the weight of his decision settled over him like a crashing wave. Your Honor, his voice came out quieter than he intended, but strong enough to make heads turn, strong enough to send a ripple through the room. I have something to say. Across the aisle, Hardwell's body went rigid, his eyes locking onto Branson with a sharp, silent warning, but it was too late. Branson turned to the judge, and for the first time since this nightmare began, someone inside the system finally decided to tell the truth. Branson inhaled sharply, his throat dry, his pulse pounding against his skin like a warning, his mind screaming at him to sit down, to shut up, to let this moment pass. But the truth had already begun its slow, inevitable escape, clawing its way past the fear, past the doubt, past the years of silence that had kept men like Hardwell untouchable. His voice trembled at first, but the words came anyway, unstoppable, undeniable, irreversible. I saw it, he said, his hands tightening against the wooden podium as every eye in the courtroom snapped toward him, the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest like an iron hand. That night, I saw Hardwell slam the kid against the wall. I saw him knock the air out of him. I saw him hit him. The words rang through the air, slicing through the thick tension like a blade, leaving nothing but stunned silence in their wake. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the rustling of papers, the sharp scraping of chairs against polished floors as the prosecution scrambled, as the public defenders turned to each other in shock, as the judge lifted her hand in an attempt to restore order, but the noise wouldn't settle, because this wasn't just a statement, this was a bomb detonating at the heart of the case. Hardwell's jaw locked, his fingers curling against the table, his entire body tensing with a quiet, simmering rage as Branson continued, the momentum carrying him forward now, past the fear, past the regret, past the years of telling himself that this was just the way things worked. Jalen didn't resist, Branson said, his voice steadier now, louder, as if saying it again would make up for all the times he had let things like this go. He was just a kid walking home. Hardwell attacked him. The prosecutor shot up from her seat, her face unreadable, but her voice sharp as a blade. Your Honor, given this new testimony, the prosecution formally requests an immediate internal review into Officer Hardwell's conduct and a full investigation into the handling of this case. The judge remained silent, her fingers steepled against her lips, her expression giving nothing away, but Malcolm saw it. The shift, the moment the balance of power in the room began to tilt, the moment Hardwell was no longer the untouchable figure he had always been. Hardwell exhaled slowly, his fingers twitching against the edge of the table, his jaw working as he turned his head just slightly toward Branson, his voice so low that only he could hear it. You just signed your own death warrant, he murmured, his lips barely moving, his words laced with quiet venom. Branson swallowed, his muscles locking, the familiar coil of fear tightening in his gut, but something was different now, something was broken, something was free. Maybe, he muttered back, his voice quiet but unshaken, but at least I can sleep at night. Across the city, in a small newsroom buzzing with energy, Louis Devereaux's phone vibrated against the desk, the message flashing across the screen like a beacon in the dark. Got something for you. Check the files. His heart kicked up as he opened the email attachment, his breath catching as the video loaded, the grainy security footage shaking slightly from the angle of an old rooftop camera, but the image was clear enough, damning enough, devastating enough. The timestamp matched the night of the arrest. The street was empty, the police cruiser pulling up just as a small figure appeared on the screen. Jalen. The footage wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be, because the moment Hardwell's hand shot out, the moment Jalen's body slammed against the brick wall, the moment the officer's fist drove into the boy's ribs, it was all there. Cassandra Brooks stood frozen in the courtroom, her fingers gripping the small gold cross around her neck, her breath caught in her chest as the moment unfolded in front of her, as Branson spoke, as the prosecution demanded justice, as the world finally saw her grandson the way she had always seen him, not as a suspect, not as a problem, not as a statistic, but as a child who should have never been here in the first place. Her knees went weak, tears spilling freely down her cheeks as she covered her mouth with her hands, her entire body shaking with something between grief and relief, the weight of the fight, the pain of the struggle, the long, endless nights of fear crashing down on her all at once. They heard him. They finally heard him. Judge Blake straightened in her seat, exhaling slowly, her eyes flickering toward Hardwell, toward the prosecution, toward Malcolm, before settling on Branson, her voice clear, sharp, unshakable. Given the severity of the allegations, this court orders an immediate internal investigation into Officer Hardwell and the circumstances surrounding the arrest of Jalen Brooks. Officer Branson, you are to remain available for further testimony. Officer Hardwell, consider yourself officially under review. We will reconvene in 24 hours. The gavel struck the wood, the sound reverberating through the room like a final sentence, like the first crack in an unbreakable wall. Hardwell didn't move, didn't flinch, but Malcolm saw it. The flicker of something behind his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the moment he realized that for the first time in his career, he was losing. Jalen sat in the cold, windowless room, his small hands folded tightly in his lap, his fingers digging into his skin as he stared at the papers spread before him, the black ink on white pages feeling heavier than any set of handcuffs. Across the table, the prosecutor leaned forward, her voice slow, deliberate, carefully calculated to sound like kindness when it was really just another trap. If you sign this, you can go home tonight, she said, tapping the paper with perfectly manicured nails, her expression unreadable. No trial. No more time in detention. No more risk of this getting worse. You just say you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you admit to resisting arrest, and this all goes away. Malcolm's jaw tightened, his hands fisting beneath the table, his entire body stiff with barely restrained fury, because he had seen this before, had watched this system grind down kids like Jalen until they believed their only way out was through submission. But before he could speak, before he could tell Jalen that they weren't going to take this deal, the boy shifted, his small voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I'm not guilty, Jalen said, his hands trembling but his voice steady, his dark eyes locking onto the prosecutors with a quiet, unshakable defiance. "Why should I have to lie?" The words stunned the room into silence, the weight of them settling like bricks, the finality in his tone something no one had expected. The prosecutor's expression flickered, just for a second, just long enough for Malcolm to see the frustration behind her carefully controlled mask. Because this was supposed to be easy, this was supposed to be the moment where the kid folded, where the pressure became too much, where he caved to the system designed to break him. But Jalen didn't cave. And then the door burst open. Terrence Bolton stood there, breathless, sweat dampening the collar of his worn jacket, his eyes darting around the room like he was expecting someone to drag him back into the shadows he had just escaped from. "I'll testify," he said, his voice rough, tired, the weight of too many sleepless nights dragging at his words. "I saw it. I saw what they did to him." Malcolm was already on his feet, already moving, already pushing forward before the prosecutor could recover, before she could shut this down, before she could do what the system always did and pretend that the truth didn't exist. Panic spread like wildfire through the police department. Officers whispered furiously in the halls, frantic phone calls were made, orders were barked in hushed, desperate tones as the realization slammed into them like a wrecking ball. They weren't in control anymore. Hardwell's name was being whispered in ways it had never been before, not as the officer who ran things with an iron fist, not as the man who could make cases disappear, but as a liability, a problem, a man about to burn the entire precinct down with him. Somewhere in the chaos, Hardwell sat alone in his office, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white, his pulse a steady, thunderous roar in his ears as the walls he had spent years building around himself started to collapse. Across the city, news cameras clicked into focus, satellite feeds hummed to life, and a bold red banner ran across television screens in homes, offices, and restaurants. Live. Key witness in Jalen Brooks' case steps forward. Louis Devereaux stood in the middle of the courthouse steps, the buzz of reporters surrounding him, his microphone picking up every word, every breath, every ounce of tension thickening the air. Terrence Bolton, a local resident, has come forward with eyewitness testimony contradicting the police report of the night in question, Louis announced, his voice sharp, relentless, feeding the growing firestorm of public outrage. With this new development, the defense is calling for an immediate review of the entire arrest, placing further pressure on an already crumbling case. In the courtroom, Jalen sat still, his chest tight, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as the judge's gaze swept across the room, as the prosecution shifted uncomfortably, as the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone inside these four walls. This wasn't just another case anymore. This was a reckoning. And Hardwell knew it. His breath came too fast, too sharp, his hands clenching into fists beneath the table as he stared straight ahead, not daring to look at Branson, at Malcolm, at Jalen, at anyone who had just ripped his world apart. His career was unraveling, his carefully built power slipping through his fingers like sand, his name being dragged through every headline, every broadcast, every whispered conversation in the halls of the very precinct that had once protected him. He had spent years bending the system to his will, making sure no one ever questioned him, making sure no one ever fought back. But now they had. And for the first time in his life, he was the one losing. Judge Blake's gavel struck the wood with a force that echoed through the tense, crowded courtroom, her expression unreadable as she lifted her gaze, eyes sweeping over the sea of expectant faces, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. "This court will recess while we deliberate," she announced, her voice sharp, steady, final. The words sent a ripple through the room, a collective breath held and released, attorneys shifting, reporters scrambling to update their headlines, the audience murmuring in anticipation. Malcolm turned toward Jalen, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder, but he could feel the tension coiling beneath his fingertips, the way Jalen's small frame was stiff with unease, with the unbearable weight of waiting. The truth was out, the evidence laid bare, the system forced to reckon with what it had tried to bury, but that didn't mean justice was guaranteed. Across the courtroom, Hardwell stood motionless, his face a carefully constructed mask of indifference, but Malcolm saw it, the tightness in his jaw, the flicker of unease in his eyes, the twitch in his fingers as he flexed them against the table. He wasn't the kind of man who sat still when the walls started closing in. He was the kind of man who ran. The moment the judge stepped away, the courtroom buzzing with restless energy, Hardwell moved. His steps were quick but calculated, slipping through the shifting bodies of attorneys and reporters, his hand already reaching for the exit, his breath steady, his mind racing. If he could just get outside, just get to his car, just disappear before this circus turned into a full-blown execution, he could still control the narrative. But as he reached the doors, a figure stepped into his path, broad shoulders blocking his way, dark eyes locking onto his with a cold finality that sent ice curling through his veins. Officer Branson didn't speak, didn't move, didn't have to. The message was clear. This time, there was nowhere to run. The courtroom doors burst open as uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence cutting through the noise, their movements precise, deliberate, methodical. The prosecutor stood now, her voice ringing through the stunned silence, sharp and unyielding. Your Honor, in light of new evidence and testimony, the prosecution formally charges Officer Vincent Hardwell with excessive use of force, falsification of police reports, and obstruction of justice. The words slammed into the room like a bomb detonating, gasps rippling through the crowd, the tension snapping like a wire pulled too tight. Hardwell's expression didn't change, but his fingers curled into fists, his breath coming faster now, because the thing he had feared most was happening right in front of him. He was losing control. Jalen sat frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as he forced himself to breathe, to process what was happening, to understand that for the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't the one in handcuffs. The judge returned to her seat, her voice calm but firm, her decision final. Given the overwhelming evidence presented in this case, all charges against Jalen Brooks are hereby dropped. He is free to go. The words barely registered before the weight lifted, before Malcolm's hand squeezed his shoulder, before Cassandra Brooks let out a choked sob of relief, her hands clasped together like a prayer answered, before the room erupted into chaos, cameras flashing, reporters shouting, voices overlapping as the truth that had fought so hard to be heard was finally, undeniably acknowledged. But outside, something bigger was happening. The city was awake. Crowds swelled in the streets, voices rising in unison, signs lifted high above heads, faces streaked with tears, with anger, with a relentless demand for justice that had been ignored for far too long. Jalen's name was no longer just a name. It was a symbol, painted across banners, chanted in protest lines, echoed through microphones and television screens as cities across the country took up the fight, as the people refused to let this moment pass quietly into history. The air was charged with something electric, something unstoppable, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years, waiting for a spark to ignite it. Hardwell was led out of the courtroom in cuffs, his expression unreadable, his eyes refusing to meet the flashing cameras, the questions being hurled at him from all sides. For years, he had been untouchable. Now, he was nothing more than a disgraced officer, a headline, a cautionary tale for the men who had once stood beside him. But Malcolm knew better than to believe this was the end. One man falling didn't mean the system was fixed. One case didn't erase the hundreds of others that had been buried, ignored, lost to the cracks in a system designed to forget them. Jalen stepped outside for the first time in weeks, the sun hitting his face, the noise of the city wrapping around him like a tide pulling him into something bigger than himself. He wasn't the same kid who had walked home that night, the kid who had been thrown to the ground, the kid who had been told no one would believe him. Now they had no choice but to listen. But as he looked at the faces in the crowd, at the signs demanding justice not just for him but for everyone who had never gotten their day in court, he understood the truth that no ruling could change. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The weight of the case had shifted from a local courtroom to something much bigger, something unstoppable, something that had been waiting to explode for far too long. The FBI had taken over. What started as a single police brutality case had unraveled into a web of corruption, cover-ups, falsified reports, missing evidence, and a system that had protected men like Hardwell for years. Agents moved swiftly through the precinct, collecting files, pulling surveillance, demanding reports that had been buried under layers of red tape. Officers who had once walked the halls with unchecked authority now moved with careful steps, their voices lower, their shoulders stiffer, their eyes darting to every passing agent like they were waiting for the inevitable tap on the shoulder. Hardwell had fallen, but now the entire system was under a microscope, and for the first time, there was no way to hide. Jalen sat stiffly at the press conference, his hands folded in his lap, his heart hammering in his chest as cameras clicked, as reporters murmured, as the world watched him in a way it never had before. At the podium, the police chief cleared his throat, his face tight with controlled emotion, his voice rehearsed and measured, but Jalen heard what lay beneath it: the reluctance, the forced humility, the realization that this moment wasn't about him, but about what the public demanded. On behalf of this department, the chief began, his fingers curling against the podium, we acknowledge the wrongful arrest and mistreatment of Jalen Brooks. We deeply regret the failures that led to this situation, and we offer our formal apology to him and his family. The words should have meant something. They should have carried weight. But Jalen felt nothing. Nothing could erase the nights he spent locked away. Nothing could take away the moment he hit the pavement, the hands that had grabbed him, the voices that told him he didn't matter. An apology wasn't justice. Across the city, in a high-security courthouse, Vincent Hardwell sat in the defendant's chair, his hands clasped together, his jaw clenched as the prosecution laid out the case against him in excruciating detail. Excessive force, obstruction of justice, falsification of reports, destruction of evidence. The charges piled up like bricks on his back, each one heavier than the last, each one tightening the noose that had once been reserved for the very people he had spent his career hunting down. He had walked into too many courtrooms believing himself invincible, believing no one could touch him, believing that a badge was enough to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. But now he was the one in the hot seat, the one being scrutinized, the one whose entire existence had been reduced to a criminal case number. Branson sat in his empty office, his resignation letter crisp and final in his hands, his badge lying face down on the desk, the weight of it suddenly meaningless. He was done. He had spent his entire career justifying, ignoring, pretending that looking the other way made him innocent. But he wasn't innocent. He had seen it happen before Jalen. He had watched too many names get lost in reports that never saw the light of day. And even though he had finally done the right thing, even though he had stood up and spoken out, he couldn't stay. The system was built to protect itself, and Branson was tired of being part of something that crushed people like Jalen and rewarded men like Hardwell. Louis Devereaux watched the final cut of his documentary, his fingers drumming against his desk, his eyes scanning the screen as Jalen's face appeared, frozen in the moment he had first taken the stand, his voice unwavering, his truth undeniable. "They beat me." Those words had started a fire. Those words had forced people to listen. Those words had taken a local case and turned it into an international reckoning. The footage rolled through interviews, surveillance clips, courtroom testimony, protests that had shut down entire city blocks, voices demanding change, voices that refused to be silenced. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a movement. When the credits rolled, Louis exhaled slowly, knowing that once this was released, once the world saw the full scope of what had happened, there would be no going back. Jalen walked home that night, his hands in his pockets, his steps slower than they had been before, his body no longer shrinking into itself, no longer weighed down by fear. The city was different now, louder, sharper, more awake than it had ever been, but deep inside, he knew the truth. This wasn't the end. His name was cleared. His story had been heard. But there were others, kids like him, stories like his, voices that still hadn't been given the chance to fight back. The system was still standing. The fight wasn't over. And Jalen Brooks wasn't done. Jalen Brooks' name was no longer just a name. It was a symbol, a rallying cry, a force that refused to be forgotten, etched into headlines, painted across protest signs, spoken in the streets with a weight that carried beyond his own story. What had started as a single moment of defiance in a courtroom had spread like wildfire, igniting conversations in classrooms, on news panels, in living rooms where people who had never met him now spoke his name with reverence, with anger, with hope. He had become something bigger than himself, something that stretched beyond his 12 years, beyond the night he had been thrown to the pavement, beyond the fear that had once held his voice captive. Jalen Brooks was proof that silence did not have to be the only option. The letter arrived on a crisp morning, the envelope thick, the university logo stamped in bold, silver letters across the top. Cassandra Brooks held it in her hands, her fingers trembling as she read the words that confirmed what she had always believed about her grandson, that he was meant for more. A full scholarship, a future laid before him that had once seemed impossible, an acknowledgement that his story had value, that his voice had changed something. She had fought for him, had prayed over him, had stood in front of the world and dared them to see her grandson not as a statistic, not as another boy swallowed by the system, but as a child who deserved to dream beyond survival. And now, as she watched him read the letter, his eyes wide with something between shock and pride, she felt a kind of joy so fierce it nearly broke her. She had never been prouder. Malcolm Grayson stood before another judge, another defendant, another child staring up at him with the same fear he had seen in Jalen's eyes. The work hadn't stopped. The fight hadn't ended. If anything, the case of Jalen Brooks had only exposed the tip of something deeper, something far uglier than one corrupt officer or one falsified report. The system had cracks that ran so deep they touched everything, and Malcolm had made a choice, to spend every waking moment widening those cracks until they shattered. Jalen had been a victory, but he could not be the last. Malcolm's hands tightened around his briefcase as he met the boy's eyes, steady and sure. "We fight," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "We don't back down." Because he had seen what happened when people refused to stay silent. He had seen what was possible when the truth was dragged into the light. Louis Devereaux scrolled through his notes, his desk cluttered with files, voice recordings, scattered headlines that all led to one undeniable fact: there were more Jalens out there. His documentary had shattered viewership records. The footage of Jalen's trial had spread across the world, but the fight was far from over. There were names buried in sealed reports, bodies broken in the shadows, voices still screaming to be heard. The case had turned him into something more than just a journalist. He was a witness now. And witnesses had a responsibility. He pressed play on his recorder, his fingers tightening over his pen as he prepared for the next interview. This wasn't just another story. This was a mission. Jalen stood at the podium, the microphone crackling slightly as the crowd before him stretched farther than he could see, faces turned toward him, waiting, listening, holding on to every breath he took. He was taller now, older, no longer the scared 12-year-old boy in a courtroom, no longer the kid who had been told that no one would believe him. He was here. He was still standing. He glanced at his grandmother in the front row, at Malcolm just beyond her, at Louis standing off to the side with his camera rolling, at the sea of people who had come not just for him, but for the fight, for the truth, for the promise that they would never let silence win again. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaned slightly forward, let the weight of the moment settle over his shoulders, and then, with a voice stronger than it had ever been, he spoke. "They wanted me to stay silent. But I didn't.